Welcome to the third of our Stewardship Series events across the country. I'm Weston Wamp, the founder of the Millennial Debt Foundation, and we're live from Milwaukee, Wisconsin at the Bradley Foundation, and honored to be here, honored to have a partnership with an in-state group, the Institute for Reforming Government. So thanks to both the Bradley Foundation and IRG for participating. And most of all, thanks to you guys for taking time out of a busy congressional schedule to talk about issues that don't get talked about a whole lot. So we'll start there. I mean, both of you are guys who, in your time in Congress, have gone out of your way to talk about the fiscal perils that may lie ahead. There's not a whole lot of political points to be scored talking about those issues. Why would you tell younger Americans that the mounting debt and deficits, as far as we can see, why does it matter?
Maybe I'll take it out of the gates. I mean, we look at the past 12 and a half months, we've gone through some really challenging times, but we've also seen really excessive government spending. And so you talk to kind of macroeconomists, you're concerned about the tipping point, and you talk about a debt to GDP ratio. We got about $30 trillion in debt. That's about 100% debt to GDP. And then part of that concern is we're paying about $300 billion a year just on interest on that debt. But it's like we're holding a credit card with a low introductory interest rate, paying between 1% and 2%. If that starts to slide back up like it did in the 80s, that's going to crowd out all the other types of spending that we prioritize, whether or not be national defense, key domestic spending, or, and most importantly, making sure we're holding up our entitlements, Social Security and Medicare for our seniors.
I sort of think about this through a geopolitical lens, right? It's my belief that we're in the early stages of a new Cold War with communist China, and I think we're losing. We're losing not only because we're not yet convinced that we deserve to win for a variety of reasons, but because we've woken up and realized that we are dangerously dependent in many cases on hostile foreign powers for the manufacturing of critical technologies. This is probably the biggest lesson learned of the pandemic, is that our supply chains are infected with single points of failure, whether it's testing reagent that we need in early days in coronavirus, or we're waking up and realizing that we're dependent on China for rare earths. And I think an increasing and unsustainable level of debt further exacerbates that problem of dependency and further increases the likelihood that we're either going to experience a massive economic shock that's going to hurt people, primarily working class Wisconsinites or seniors living on a fixed income, or we're going to stumble into a war on someone else's terms, because the practical reality is that the more we waste money on unproductive investments in this country, the more we crowd out resources that we need to make critical defense investments, for example. And you look at defense spending over time, the reason it looks like a sine curve is because we always do this after we successfully win a conflict. We disinvest in our own defense, and then we stumble into conflict on someone else's term, and that requires us to ramp up dramatically, and it's just not the way to do business. So I just think, in terms of our competition with China, the debt is a very significant issue.
A few weeks ago, we did an event that both Senator Lindsey Graham and Senator Angus King participated in. So you're not going to necessarily find a whole lot of agreement between those two in this political climate. But one of the things that Senator and former Governor King said was that he has ethical concerns that, quote, his generation is borrowing from our generation. We're all millennials. You're at the very top end. We're sort of middle-aged millennials. How much should we talk about the national debt or this issue of deficits? Because, as they're projected out, we're looking at an era of trillion-dollar deficits after the pandemic. How much should we talk about it as a generational issue?
Well, Senator King is married to a Packers fan, let the record show, so no wonder he has some basic common sense, some Midwestern common sense. Well, I think it's absolutely crucial to talk about it from a generational issue, not just in terms of the fact that I think average debt per household is now about $225,000. So that's what just each household is inheriting. But just for our generation, we can sort of see in a real way all of the government waste and all of the ways in which we're trying to funnel more and more money through a Byzantine bureaucracy that was built in the 1950s and 1960s and simply isn't suited to solving problems in 2021. So I absolutely think it is a generational issue.
We also have a really unsustainable path that we're on right now. So if you look over time, there's been periods of time where that debt has gotten out of control, but there's been an ability to bring it back down. So if you said during World War II, you'd say, okay, well, after the end of this significant conflict, there's a mission, there's an end point. On the other side of this, our spending is going to come down. As we look as to where we are right now in the United States, there is no mission that we're spending these funds on. Right. There is no end point, and the long-term trajectories have significant increases in the future, which really leverage the future of our country.
One of the things I think about when I talk to my politically apathetic millennial friends, I think maybe I don't know, I think they have some discomfort that their friend is out advocating for less government as opposed to more government, because as Dan Crenshaw often says, I think pretty aptly, the size of your heart in Washington is judged by how much money you support the government spending. Fair? I do think it's an interesting time to talk about this generationally as millennials, because the middle-aged millennials, mid-30s, and the CBO puts out a 30-year budget outlook, which gets some media attention. It's often a conversation starter. And when you look at that 30-year horizon, it takes millennials into retirement. And I find myself wanting to talk to my progressive friends or even politically moderate friends about what that 30 years, and it's an estimate, but it's a projection put together by brilliant economists. And I find myself wanting to talk to them about the scenario under which the interest we pay on the debt alone is larger than Social Security. So if you want to talk about, because that's where we're headed in 2050, based on CBO projections, so if you want to talk about the government doing good, you have to be willing to get your fiscal house in order. It's just the messaging seems off here. How do we talk to millennials across the political spectrum about why this matters?
Yeah, well, just quickly on the generational point, Brian, I don't know if you share this, but I think there's a generational divide just that is apparent every day in Congress, right? I think the new members of Congress who are millennials come in and when they get sort of a 5,000-word omnibus bill delivered to them on Christmas Eve, and then you have 3 hours to review it and vote on it, are asking simple questions like, why are we doing business this way, right? Why is it that for, I think, 40 out of the last 46 years, we haven't actually had a budget process that works on time? Just the amount of money that's wasted through continuing resolutions because we can't do basic budgeting right in the United States Congress is an issue. In other words, I think process and dysfunctional, outdated process is in some ways upstream of the actual sort of addition to our debt and deficit every single year.
A large part of the leadership has been there far too long, which causes some of this problem where it's become institutionalized. So to geek out for just a second, you're talking about some of these 10-year looks, some of these 30-year looks. The way that our federal government does accounting is a way that no business would operate in the United States of America. So they're looking at 10-year windows rather than an accrual system. This kind of gets geeky. But what you got to be thinking about is when you're making a commitment into the future, what is that long-term obligation rather than just what is that cash flow obligation in a short term. So sometimes we're far too short-sighted in Congress.
Right. Well, my fourth child's on the way. So if I were actually trying to make a good faith effort to plan things for their life, it wouldn't be, in this kind of arcane 10-year window. I'd want to say, well, what are we really setting them up? What are we signing them up for long term? But is there a point, going further in the example I gave, is there a point in this very fraught time to be talking about deficits, because again, the more you spend, the better person you are. Is there a place to message to moderates and people to the political left that it's a mathematical equation that trillions of dollars in the future are going to be wasted on debt service? That's money that theoretically, and technology might enable us to do things we can't even imagine now with that money, but we're going to have committed it.
I don't know that today it politically sells, but I think it's absolutely critical to do it because the pain hasn't been felt today. And so one of the challenges is when you get into these larger conversations with macroeconomists about debt, they're talking about what is your debt to GDP ratio, right? How big is your economy to what is the amount of debt? So if you're a family, how much do you have on your credit card versus how much do you make a year? And so that pain is further out where things have been good, where the federal government's giving out checks to individuals. An average family of four just received $5,600. So that pain's not being felt in the short term, but you need to have that conversation today because ultimately if that credit card comes due with that higher interest rate, pain's going to be felt in the future. So it's incumbent upon us to have that adult conversation today.
Well, and the pain of the fix gets more painful every day that we delay the fix, right? That's certainly true with our healthcare liabilities, with our Social Security liabilities. The more we tackle this with the sense of urgency now, the less pain we will have to endure 10 years down the road if we keep kicking the can. And I think the message to millennials is one of, okay, you think the boomers broke it? You think you're getting a raw deal? Well, suck it up, step up, let's solve it, all right? Let's be the generation that actually brings constructive solutions to the table rather than just blaming someone else for the problem or adding to the problem, right? First rule of holes, stop digging.
I think one of the challenges is often these fiscal issues get labeled as niche, and it's guys like me and you who've a background in business who get obsessed with them. But it really connects to everything, right? I mean, the most popular policies of the far left are things that still have to be paid for. In fact, they cost a whole lot of money. It comes back to that. That's why I think actually the future of the country is, in a conversation about it, must include a consideration of the fiscal future. So as a former Marine intelligence officer and a former business guy, and you're on financial services, what's your bull case for America in the next 30 years, the life of Americans, and what's your bear case? We don't know how it plays out, but I'm just curious, what do you see as being or what's the best case scenario and what's the worst case scenario? I mean, I know for you and I, one worst is that we go to 90s interest rates.
Yeah, your bear case is your debt comes due, right? And suddenly there's nobody that wants to buy American debt, and we're in a real downward spiral. That's the bear. The bull is that we work to make America more competitive, that people want to domicile jobs and businesses here. We grow our economy at a rate faster than current projections are, and we grow our way to bring back some level of stabilization. You're going to have to do major reforms even if you have that. But my bull case is that we're able to compete with China, we're able to domicile jobs in the United States, we're able to grow the economy here by making reforms that are needed.
I think I made the bear case on the front end by suggesting that we will lose a war through preemptive surrender. So I'm not sure I can put it in starker terms than that, but our adversaries refer to the next decade as the period of strategic opportunity, where they very much think they can test American limits. We just had the top military official in the Indo-Pacific, Admiral Davidson, testify before the Armed Services Committee and say that she has designs on Taiwan within the next 6 years. So this is the window right now. We have Russia massing forces in eastern Ukraine, trying to threaten an invasion of the Donbass. Iran's going to break out to enrich a nuclear weapon. I mean, it's game on right now. These are the terrible 20s. So that's the bear case. And it has various forms of apocalypse that you could tease out a little bit. The bull case, I would say a few things, right? All right, the country just went through this crazy once-in-a-lifetime crisis, right? And certainly there was a ton of pain endured that we just never want to have to go through that again. But I also think it's forcing everyone to look around and say, what is actually essential in our lives? I think we're going to see long-lasting productivity gains in certain areas, certainly when it comes to synthetic biotech. We've made generational advances over the last year. We've squeezed a decade's worth of productive deregulation in the healthcare industry with telemedicine advances that we wouldn't have otherwise done were it not for this crisis. So, and then I just would add, even on our worst day, America is still the country that everybody else wants to go to, right? Like even when we're at each other's throats, America is still number one. And you want to talk about a real immigration crisis, it's right. When you can't convince anyone to come here.
That's right, yeah, that's the problem.
Yeah, exactly.
When people don't want to come here.
Yeah.
And we've got a great legacy of entrepreneurship that is in large part due to people immigrating here. It's all of our story. It's a funny thing. It's like the only thing that we all share in common is we all have an immigration story. Here's a question about Congress. I think a lot of people are just curious about the body and the institution. There's now more fame associated with it than there ever has been. You've got some legitimately famous members of Congress and social media stars, or wannabe social media stars at least. I grew up around Congress. My dad served for a while, and I heard him use this funny line about how the first bit of time you're in Congress, you look around and you go, how did I end up here? And then pretty quickly thereafter you go, how did all of these people end up here? You both come from very specific backgrounds. Business background, financial services background. You speak fluent Arabic, you've been around the world, you're well educated. How do you size up your colleagues' understanding of national security? I think all these issues are intertwined. So national security and the fiscal future of the country are intertwined. The American economy and the fiscal future of the country are intertwined. Are your colleagues, name names or not, are they up to the task? Do they get the complexities of the issues?
I'd say historically Congress has had people that want to be workhorses and some people that want to be show horses. Some people that want to drive forward policy and some people that want to be on the stage. I think now I would say some people want to be there to be measured by their Twitter followers, and some people want to be measured by their policy successes. Right. And I think that inside the institution, the public often sees those that are the show horses, those that have the largest Twitter followings. That is not a direct correlation by any means to the folks that are in the trenches trying to actually have the greatest number of policy successes. So there are individuals in Congress working hard, diving into the weeds, whether or not it's debt or national security. But often the public-facing side of Congress is far too often those with the most Twitter followers.
Right. I did have this moment coming off the House floor this week, and I just looked around, And there was literally like 50 of our colleagues that were just doing selfie videos. And the technology has gotten more advanced where they all have kind of like selfie sticks or just an entourage of people that are like cataloging everything for a virtual reality show. So that's my bearish case for Congress right there. But I will say, I think the biggest area where I kind of revised my ideological prior since coming into Congress was when I came in 2016, I just thought the problem was the people, that Congress just attracted, the fame-seeking people or people that just wanted to kind of get rich off the office. I don't know. I think we're seeing a whole new generation step up and run from very interesting backgrounds. And a lot of them want to serve the country and want to do the right thing, but they get jammed into a process that's very top-heavy, right? Where a few people have all the power, and they struggle to succeed in that process where all the incentives are pushing them, as Bryan rightly said, towards getting more followers, getting more clicks, as opposed to sitting there for 3 hours in a financial services hearing and like digging through the minutia. Yeah, Bryan likes doing that, but not many other people do.
You mentioned Twitter. I wasn't planning on having a conversation about Twitter, but I find myself, when I talk about the national debt and the lack of long-term policy, I find myself talking about Twitter because I've got this theory that in the 90s and into the 2000s, we began to govern kind of Fox News or MSNBC cycle to cycle, the 24-hour news cycle, dictated things. And I now wonder, particularly as millennials come of age and the numbers are about to proliferate in Congress, how much does Twitter influence the psyche of members of Congress, some members of Congress? I mean, it's not just younger members of Congress who seemingly obsess over Twitter specifically. I don't think a lot, they say that like 1% of the country creates like 90% of Twitter's content or something crazy like this. Yeah. So most of the country doesn't care about Twitter, but I don't know that folks quite realize how much it is in the political psyche right now.
It's huge and destructive, I think. I mean, go ahead.
No, I think some of it, right, is the challenge of how people obtain media. There are fewer long-form conversations like we're having today. But to talk about what is the debt of the United States, what are the long-term consequences of that is really hard to distill into 3 to 4 words. Twitter works well when you have it 3 to 4 words. What we need to have a conversation is, it takes a half hour, it takes an hour, it takes an hour and a half. And even that is only brushing the surface of what is an incredibly important topic. The same in our national defense. Yeah. Can you get it and distill it to 3 to 4 words? But also, that's how people are consuming media. And so one of the challenges, how do we take some of these really complicated topics and how do we engage people in a slightly more long-form manner so we can have a more in-depth conversation on the topic?
Right. I think the emergence of podcasts and the way it's displacing traditional media is one opportunity to do that. I tend to enjoy those conversations more. There is a weird thing, though, where I feel like we've been, at least in the last year, there on pretty much every very difficult budget vote, right? And some tough, the omnibus vote, this, that, where, we thought we did the right thing from a fiscal conservatism and just basic stewardship of the taxpayer dollar perspective. But I heard nothing about that, right? But if I don't dunk on AOC or Maxine Waters on Twitter, I'll hear about that lack of action, right? So there's a weird incentive structure that I think is misaligned in Congress right now. And I have a lot of weird thoughts about how you kind of get members of Congress to pay attention to their committee work as opposed to the cable news and social media celebrity work, but we don't need to go into
what are those thoughts? I mean, I'm curious, because I think this is all connected to why can the country, through our Congress, not just circle the wagons and go, okay, we need to make some reforms to Medicare to put it on a sustainable path.
First.
Okay. To me, it's all how you structure the committee process, right? So we're talking about debt, deficit. The Budget Committee has been completely stripped of any authority it has, right? And then there's this fundamental divide between authorizers and appropriators that, to me, no longer makes any sense. So if I were king for a day, and you don't want a king in Congress, I would collapse the Appropriations Committee into the Authorizing Committee, and I would restructure the entire committee process so that it's geared towards doing oversight of the executive branch, and I would adopt a multi-year budgeting cycle. My predecessor, Reed Ribble, had a biannual budgeting bill that went nowhere simply because leadership in Congress defeated it. So there's a whole host of things you can do in committee restructure and reform that I think could get the incentive structure different and get members to pay attention to our long-term debt problems.
Some of this, I think, builds on how the mainstream media presents a lot of this information. You're referencing our friend Dan Crenshaw saying they measure your heart by the amount of money you spend in Washington, D.C. But I think that's actually also true across the board with the mainstream media. They want to come and have conversations about what are you spending money on and how are you solving that problem through spending money. And so instead of measuring the success by the outcome. They're measuring success by the input. In doing so, you're incentivizing to increase the input, federal government money, rather than to actually address what is the output. We see it in our education system. We measure how much we spend per pupil rather than how quality is the education and what is the final education output at the end. We can look at national defense. Even on the defense side, I think many people want to measure simply the input rather than just the output.
Yeah.
And we could go through a litany of those items, and Mike was referencing earlier. I mean, we've stood on what I feel like is a lonely island, taking some tough fiscally conservative votes over the last 12 months. And rest assured, the mainstream media, the commentary you hear about that is that you don't have a heart, rather than saying you're trying to actually fight and obtain a better outcome for the American people.
Yeah.
Well, even in defense, I mean, right, for the last 4 years, we had a brutal debate over NATO, right? The future of NATO, whether our NATO allies were meeting their 2% of GDP thresholds on NATO spending. I get it. We should encourage them to spend more. I like that idea, right? Burden sharing by our allies. But it is the wrong metric, right? It is an input metric, right? In other words, I care less if they're spending 2% of their GDP on defense and more on what they're actually buying for that money and whether the things they're buying talk to the things we're buying so that we can deter the Russians by denial in Eastern Europe. And we're not measuring it that way right now.
All right, a couple questions kind of back to the acute deficit issue in front of us. You're on financial services. The Federal Reserve has tested the laws of gravity because they took the pandemic on head on. Fair? And a lot of this gets wonky, and so you can help give some context for it. But a lot of the new debt is gone onto the Fed's balance sheet. Now, and that's different than what we do in a sort of normal year, and the bonds hit the market and they're consumed by everybody from foreign countries to pension funds. Is it sustainable? What are the problems? What are your concerns with this ballooning balance sheet?
Chairman Powell, the head of the Federal Reserve, he and I have had this conversation on the record in the committee. I don't share his concern. I don't share his view that we're not going to see the inflationary pressures in the near term. So his view is that we're not going to see inflationary pressures in the near term, and therefore he's comfortable continuing to hold that level of a balance sheet. I asked him how long we would hold $7 trillion on, and his projection was that most likely we would see that held on the balance sheet through maturity, meaning a really long time. My broader view is that I hold real concerns that we're going to enter an inflationary period sooner than the Fed is projecting. And that is more pressure as to why we have to properly address the level of spending that we're seeing in D.C.
Monetary policy, I think, dovetails into national security policy because China is our adversary, whether there's political disagreement there or not. I think common sense should prevail, and they're not a friend long term if we're having these generational conversations. I think they're aware that the dollar, its reserve currency status is actually even a national security asset, isn't it? Yeah. And you talked earlier about, earlier today, we were having a conversation about their awareness, China's awareness of the potentials of digital currencies. How do these intersect? I mean, how do cryptocurrencies intersect in these conversations about the fiscal future of the country?
Well, if you look, 1,000 years ago, the Chinese invented paper currency, and today they're trying to dominate digital currency with the digital yuan. And if you kind of start to dig into this, I mean, I would go so far as to say their explicit goal is to not only de-dollarize their own economy, but basically undermine the dollar's role as the global reserve currency. And that takes away one of our biggest weapons or tools in our kit, right? When we try and prevent North Korea from getting a nuclear weapon or Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, we use that in order to apply economic pressure against them, right? It's just one of the most useful tools in our kit. So you take that away and you fundamentally take America down a couple notches in terms of our leadership of the free world. But I think it's actually deeper than that. I think if you sort of dig in to what they're doing with digital currency, you realize that this is a means to the end of total control by the Chinese Communist Party, right? It's like a way to turbocharge what they're doing with tracking people on Xi Jinping thought on their app, right? Tracking every aspect of your life and adopting a model of total techno-totalitarian control. So the more you dig into this and debt, you realize we're not talking about a difference of tactics or dollars here, dollars there. We're talking about a fundamentally different vision for the future of the world. We're talking about a clash of values ultimately in this debate, I think.
Yeah.
The dollar being the reserve currency is absolutely critical, as Mike identifies there. If you think of just the impact that this has had on Iran over the past handful of years, right? The importance of a maximum pressure campaign to prevent Iran from, one, developing a nuclear weapon, but two, to be a state sponsor of terrorism. You can put unilateral trade sanctions against Iran, but what really brought that to bear, which really began the pressure campaign, was altering and going through the sanctions vis-a-vis the U.S. banking structure. Right. And by doing that, and if the U.S. was not the world reserve currency, we wouldn't have had that leverage on Iran. And that's exactly, I think, why Mike correctly identifies why China's so interested at removing the U.S. from being the world reserve currency. And again, one of the great concerns is if we get to a spot where our debt begins to spiral, we could very easily lose that position of having the world reserve currency.
One of the challenges I find in talking to people about the national debt is that the national debt is really not as big a problem as the fact that we are entering what I refer to as the era of trillion-dollar deficits, and we've got this trajectory that'll take us from roughly 100% of debt to GDP to 250% under the alternative scenario that CBO puts forward. When we talk to people about these issues, one of the challenges is people go, "Oh, well, you work on national debt. We need a balanced budget amendment." That's simple. The sort of bad news is that the real solutions we need are more complex, but they're more politically attainable, right? Really, we need to just stabilize the situation, and we could probably grow our way to a better place. How do we message that? I mean, the thing that people default to is pretty simple, actually very difficult, maybe politically impossible. Where we need to go is more complex, but not as hard to get to.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you look at sort of past failed efforts, right? Simpson Bowles probably being the biggest example of that. There's a variety of, you can read a lot of autopsies about that, but we kind of took a look at that and determined that it probably isn't a good idea to try and tackle everything at once in one fell swoop, just because it's very difficult politically. So the reason that I introduced, and a few others in the Senate and the House, it's a bicameral bill called the Trust Act. The goal was to sort of break that big problem up into a variety of different parts. So you create a rescue task force for each of the trust funds that's going bankrupt over the next 10 years, whether it's the Highway Trust Fund, Social Security Trust Fund, and you create a parliamentary process in Congress that allows those task forces, once they agree on a solution, to actually bring that bill to the floor of the House for an actual vote, which is another reason why past efforts have failed. So I think there's a way, that's not sexy, but you can break it up into just in smaller parts.
And as we look at the efficiencies that were created in the Defense Department under the BRAC Commission, right? It was similar in that regard, if you want to comment on it, because I think it's an important aspect of how Congress changed the parliamentary procedures to force a tough vote, but ultimately for the benefit of the American people.
Totally agree.
Yeah. Well, the last thing's this. I have the expectation that if from this point forward policy doesn't have a bipartisan component, then we can just expect that when the pendulum swings back, it gets repealed. I think that's sort of a fair expectation moving forward. So where do you think there might be consensus that can be built across the aisle that will move us in the direction of stewardship, that will improve the budget process, whatever it might, baby steps first, right? We're not going to go pass a balanced budget amendment anytime soon.
Well, I mean, I actually think it's worse than that, right? Because it's not only that, it's going to be that Article 1, the legislative branch, keeps sending all of its constitutional authority to Article 2, the executive branch, and then we just ping pong between different executive order versions of what is and isn't allowed. And that just creates chaos for the American economy and every business that is trying to survive in the American economy. And it creates constitutional chaos that I think erodes your average American's respect for the institution that is Congress and the executive branch and the federal government, but also just like basic rule of law. How we fix that? Bryan has the answer to that question, and I will defer to him right now.
There is a breakdown in. I would say there's also a breakdown in trust relationships. I don't have an easy solution for this, but I think of it in the business context. I mean, I've sat across the table in very heated negotiations. Maybe my side is trying to sell the widget, their side's trying to buy the widget. We start off on different points on price, but we could negotiate in a respectful, honest, and frank manner. Not that you'd ever betray your side, but you're ultimately trying to reach a solution. Where far too often I think Congress doesn't try to come into the table and try to build that trust relationship. I'm not offering an easy solution to this, but as I look back over some of the large compromises or large ways that people have actually come together, there's often been a large relationship between those key principles.
Could I just comment on that? Because you mentioned Angus King before. Senator King and I co-chaired something called the Cyberspace Solarium Commission for the last year and a half. It was a special commission set up by Congress in order to solve our crisis in cyberspace where we're under increasing attack. The only reason that worked, and the only reason we were actually able to pass the most significant piece of cyber legislation in American history, was because Angus and I developed a relationship built on trust, and that resulted in honest discussions and negotiations.
That's why it's the Packers fan.
That's right. Yeah, it was built
That's right.
on Lambeau Field. It was built on the frozen tundra, is
Sure.
what I'm saying. But I totally agree with what you're saying, Bryan.
Thank you, guys. Thanks for your time. We hit 1:30, so we'll honor your time, but thanks for your service and for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
When we come back, CJ Szafir, the president of the Institute for Reforming Government, will join me for a conversation we pre-recorded with the former governor of Wisconsin, Scott Walker. And after that, I'll go ahead and introduce our closing panel, which is between the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee in the Wisconsin State Legislature, John Macco, and his Democratic friend, frankly, I think that'll be the spirit of the conversation, the Wisconsin Revenue Secretary, Peter Barca. CJ, why don't you lead us off by telling us a bit about your organization? We're grateful to be partnered with you on this event today, and introduce our guest and your connection to the former governor.
Sure. Thank you so much. I'm CJ Szafir. I'm the president of the Institute for Reforming Government, a think tank based in Madison, Wisconsin, that's focused on advancing the next wave of reforms in free markets and limited government and education reform. And previously, our national honorary chairman was Governor Scott Walker, so it's a privilege for me to introduce him. Former Governor Scott Walker, current president of the Young America's Foundation. Governor Walker, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, it's great to be with both of you, and thanks for your commitment on this critical issue. I know we'll talk more in depth, but when I think of reaching out to students, obviously a lot of students in college think about student debt, but the national debt's a far greater issue, both now and in the future, than even the crisis that many face with student loan debt.
Why don't we start at the state level? Tell us a little bit about what you ran on to get elected, and then what you found yourself inheriting when you became governor of Wisconsin.
Yeah, when I came in, and I got to tell you, about a year before I ran for office, I went down and saw my good friend Mitch Daniels, spent a day with him in Indianapolis because I wanted to learn from one of the best. For years, I'd also served with Tommy Thompson, so another great leader, but particularly Mitch Daniels, at least in my time frame, was kind of the go-to guy when you looked at how to effectively manage government, how to shrink the size of government and make what's there work more effectively. And so I was well prepared. I knew coming in that Wisconsin in 2010, when I ran, had both an economic and a fiscal crisis. The state had lost over 133,000 jobs in the term before I took office. Unemployment peaked out at about 9.2% early in 2010. And when we came in, we knew there was a gap in the budget. By the time we got there, it had grown to about $3.6 billion. That's billion with a B in Wisconsin, which is a mid-sized state. And so we knew everything we talked about had to be about how we're going to get the economic and the fiscal crises in our state addressed. So much so that I used to joke that even if you asked me in a debate or an interview what my mother's maiden name was, I said it's Fitch, and every Fitch I know cares about my plan to balance the budget and get the economy going again. We were that laser focused on the issues. When we came in, it was in many ways far worse. Many of the bills had not been paid. There was raids on a number of the trust funds, the funds that had been set aside. They still had a huge budget gap. And that's one of the biggest reasons why, and I know, CJ, you know this well, you were in the thick of it then, and you've studied it well since, but why we had to take on what was then called the Budget Repair Bill. It ultimately became Act 10, and that was putting in place major reforms, not just to take care of the temporary budget crisis, but really to put in place structural changes both for state and local governments, so we didn't have to keep coming back and repeating that crisis over and over again.
Governor, when I think about your legacy as governor, whether people agreed with you or didn't or disagreed with you, you were willing to spend political capital on the things you believed in, and you took risks, and it made you an icon in conservatism, and maybe persona non grata in some liberal circles. But you did what you believed in, and it's funny. I mean, most people I think who get involved in politics, who jump into this arena, do so with that same intent. It's just really hard in office. You know, it occurs to us often when we talk about the country's long-term fiscal challenges that the solutions aren't so much a mystery. It's just gathering the political will and really the willingness for those in power to spend political capital to do the right thing. So how would you encourage those in Congress to look at these long-term issues? The solutions aren't particularly sexy, but they're very important to the future of the country and to our generation, your son's generation.
Well, great question. A couple key things. Again, I go back to thinking about Mitch Daniels gave me some great advice that I used right on the very first day I was in office and the days that followed. He said two things that stuck with me then and still do today. One, when you're in office, he said your political capital is going to be the greatest when you first take office. And every day thereafter, particularly in the legislative body, the closer you get to an election, the less likely they are to take bold action. So do it quickly. Take action right away. Don't hem and haw. Don't glide into it. Take action as quickly as you can. And then the other part he said to me, much like it is in the private sector with capital, in this case, political capital is something you gain not by hoarding it, but by reinvesting it. A lot of people like to build up all this capital somehow thinking, someday it'll lead to great approval ratings, but they don't get very much accomplished. What we found, much as it is in the business world, you don't get it by sitting on it, you get it by reinvesting it. You take a success, and so we had a number of successes early on. By about a month into my time as governor, we knew we had to tackle this budget crisis, and we knew we'd built up enough political capital to rally the new majorities in both the state assembly and the state senate. And then it was obviously tough because it wasn't just a state battle at that point. Within days, the national big government special interest started sending first hundreds and thousands, then literally tens of thousands, to the point where there was over 100,000 people occupying our state capitol. I always say that the Occupy movement didn't start on Wall Street, it started on my street when they took over the Capitol. But we didn't back down. We knew what we were doing was right, and we tried to think more about the next generation than we did about the next election. And the good news is it paid off. Not only did our reforms work and we enacted them, a decade later, they're still working, over $13 billion of savings, and more importantly, we put power back in the hands of the hardworking taxpayers and the people they duly elect to run not just their state, but their local governments. And that has paid huge dividends. And it even helped, ironically, even though we didn't do it for that reason, when I faced a recall election, one of the few in American history to face it, we won, became the only governor in American history to win, not just with Republican and conservative votes, but a majority of independents in the same year that a majority of independents reelected Barack Obama in my state. Why? To your point, I think people more than anything, even if they don't always agree with you, they want leaders who are willing to be bold, to do what they think is right. Even if they don't always agree with you, they agree that they need leaders to step out of their comfort zone and do the right thing. And that would be my advice to anyone, whether it's a member of Congress, an elected official at the state level, or even people on the local school board, town board, or county board. You got to be bold and you got to act quickly.
Well, speaking about bold and acting quickly, Congress and Washington, D.C. seems like they no longer care. Seems like the Biden administration certainly does not care about the debt and the deficit spending. We're looking at unprecedented levels. How concerned are you, and how concerned should the American people be?
Well, $28 trillion in debt right now, with deficits that are actually bigger than the entire debt was the first year Ronald Reagan took office, with interest payments increasingly crouching out other things. I mean, if people don't care about anything else, they should realize at some point the interest on the debt will overcome almost every major thing we care about in the federal budget. And when you think about 28 trillion, people say, oh, those numbers just all blur together. For the average household, that's over $200,000 a household. That's over $85,000 per person. Or for students who I talk to, you could actually pay for a full year college education for every person graduating from high school in America you could pay for it for the next 18 years and still not have enough to cover what the debt is right now. So when people think about student loan debt, as I mentioned before, obviously it's a big issue. I could spend a whole nother session on that. I think that's too is driven by federal spending, that as student loan debt assistance went up, you saw tuition go up. That's why I'm proud that during my time as governor, we froze tuition. There's too many courses, too many other things. But that aside, with student loan debt, that's a big deal for students and families for sure. But the debt that they're inheriting is far, far, far greater than what they're going to get. And at least with student loan debt, there's at least some point in the future going to pay it off. The way we're going right now, it's only escalating. I've said in the past, the federal debt is like someone making 50 grand or 45 or 50 grand a year, sitting on $300,000 of debt, and they're actually spending more each year than they take in. If that was someone you knew and loved, a family member, a friend, you'd have an intervention because you knew they couldn't keep spending that way or things would just blow up. And that's the problem here. There's nobody out there that's having an intervention for the federal government, but they have to. And once we get healthy and open again, now more than ever, we got to wake up to the reality that as the economy improves, that's going to be the time that we got to get serious, like we did in Wisconsin, about taking on these structural issues.
Texas Congressman Dan Crenshaw, who was an early advisor to the debt commission that we started, has talked about the perils and the dangers of Washington's current attitude. There's been an attitude on both sides of the aisle that will just default to deficit spending for 20 years, but it has certainly accelerated here in the last year, to the point that Crenshaw has said, the size of your heart, I think some on the left would like you to believe, is directly correlated to how much you're willing to spend. If you're willing to spend more, then you must have a big heart. How, as we chart the future of conservatism, how do we determine where is fiscal conservatism in that mix, particularly at a time where some in the country think the more the government spends, the bigger your heart is?
Yeah, and that's a big issue, because I remember years ago I was in front of a House panel and someone asked me what I thought about bipartisanship. And I think I shocked them a little bit. I said, it depends. I said after 9/11, when we all kind of got together as a country, at least temporarily, cross-party lines, and were united, I thought that was a great thing. I said, but I pointed at the people sitting on the dais up there, both Republicans and Democrats, and said, there's a part of bipartisanship I don't like, and that is when I look at the federal debt and the deficit problems, I might argue one party's more responsible than the other, but I said you all play a role in that, because nobody's had the courage, regardless of which party was in charge, to really fundamentally do something about it. So one, it is a bipartisan problem. But secondly, to your part, from a conservative standpoint, when you look at our debt, for example, as a percentage of GDP, or an easier way to say it is our debt as a percentage of the economy, we're actually above where it was in World War II. And at least in World War II, we won the war, and then we came home and we got back to work again, and we weren't spending at those levels. Right now, we're continuing to spend on those levels, not only spend at those levels, but accelerate those levels far into the future. And I think as conservatives in our own lives, there's no way we'd run our households like this. There's no way we'd run our businesses like this. We'd be run to the ground. There'd be no one to bail us out. And so, but here's the key. I think to win this battle, we can't just be sounding like accountants. We can't just be the green eye shade folks that talk about how the numbers don't add up. We've got to talk in two ways. One, about what it means for programs that people do care about taking care of the elderly, seniors, our veterans, the military. All these things start to get squeezed out if we don't take on the debt. So wouldn't it be better to take those things on up front? And secondly, Washington, there's either this feeling that you, like you said, you have this big heart and you want to spend on everything, or you hate the government and you want it to all blow up. The reality is, I think most of us realize we think the federal government's doing too much and government in general is too much a part of our lives, but we don't want it completely gone. We don't want it to fail. We just want it to do the things it should do and do it well, and then get out of everything else it doesn't belong in. And that's, I think, a compelling message, particularly to younger Americans who look at this and say, I have a heart. I care about my fellow citizen. I want to help people who are down and out, but I don't think they're doing it very well. And the more we just hold a blind eye to the debt and deficit problems, the worse off it's going to get. And so I think we can show people that we do care, but one of the best ways you care is by getting your fiscal house in order and demand that the very few things that we should be doing, we do well, instead of just saying, well, let's just throw more money at it and hope it'll somehow get better.
Tell us about Young America's Foundation, your new leadership position, and the long game action plan, and then how that intertwines with some of the issues that we've been discussing today.
Yeah, it fits in well. In fact, if people want more details, it's beyond what I'm talking about, yaf.org/long game. For us, we looked at Young America's Foundation. YAF's been around since William F. Buckley started at his home in Sharon, Connecticut. Ronald Reagan, before he was even in office, was one of the earliest leaders in that regard. They've been around for a long time, and thanks to great leaders like Ron Robinson. In fact, the Bradley Foundation has been a long supporter as well. We're on over 2,000 college campuses supporting conservative students, professors, and others. But the long game is really when I came in February and said, as great as the work we do is, we got to do more, because we can see on campuses, in schools, in culture, and even in our communications with the censorship from big tech, that overwhelmingly the left has gone from being biased on campus to political correctness to the point where we outright have cancel culture. And why that's so damning is it means that conservative voices, whether it's a student, a speaker, even an educator, are intimidated from even speaking up. It's exactly what they tried to do to me with the 100,000 protesters occupying our Capitol, was to try and just shut us down and not let others hear our voice. And on campuses, we're fighting back. We want to be on all 4,000 campuses. We want to dramatically expand our speakers. We want to step up for more free speech. But we also know we got to engage sooner, not only in high school, but in junior high, and where needed, even in the later grades in elementary school. Because right now, it goes back to the question about the size of your heart. A lot of young people are hearing only one point of view. They're being told that, the best way to show you care about these issues is for more government and more spending and more involvement in your lives. And that's the bad news. That it shows that it's working in a poll after poll we've done. The good news is we show them a counter, it actually changes. I'll give you a good example. Student loan debt. I've talked about this before. As you can imagine, particularly amongst college students, just a poll done this week showed that students overwhelmingly want the federal government to cancel their student loan debt. Not a big surprise, right? But when you follow up with a simple question saying, do you think it's right for people who did not go to college to pay taxes to pay down your student loan debt? Some of the numbers drop dramatically, because I think young people today still believe in fairness. Similarly, you ask them about should the minimum wage be $15 an hour? Overwhelming support for that. Then you push back and say, did you know that the Congressional Budget Office says that 1.4 million jobs will be lost if that was enacted across the country? Drops by 20 points. Why I say that with all this is what it tells us is they're only hearing one side of the story. And if we can share a message that still appeals to their sense of fairness, that still appeals to their sense of wanting to make a difference in the world, but shows them that doesn't always mean you have to spend more and rely on the government more, that there are other ways to effectively help your neighbor and improve your community and your country as a whole, we can make a difference. And that's really what the long game is all about.
Let me ask the last question here. When I started the Millennial Debt Foundation, I would have conversations with everybody from potential donors to members of Congress we wanted to work with, business leaders across the country. I would literally say, we need a long game. And so I took great interest when YAF went in that direction. I think it's important that we begin to think long term, and particularly when we get so focused on infighting politically in this country, but we have, particularly with China, an adversary, and I think a generational one, who is definitely thinking long term. So how do we message to young people, not just on college campuses, but even young business leaders like our organization engages? How do we compel them, at a time where the Green New Deal is hot and we're talking about erasing student loan debt or free healthcare, that there's a dangerous world out there and we need to quit thinking election cycle. Sometimes I think it's Twitter cycle to Twitter cycle, and then at best election cycle, we need to start thinking in decades, because it's a mean world out there.
Yep. One bit of optimism I have in that regard, and it's still a heavy lift, but for all the talk and attention on Twitter, for example, every Pew Research does a study and shows that about 22% last year, 22% of the population is on Twitter. But and get this, about 80% of the tweets done on Twitter by that 22% of the population are done by 10% of the people on Twitter. So effectively, that means when something's trending, that represents maybe 3% of the population. And yet media in general disproportionately gives the view that anything that's trending on Twitter, which is overwhelmingly more liberal biased than conservative biased, is somehow a sense of reality. It's not. The good news for us is, again, this poll we just came out with, many others we've done in the past year, show that at least amongst young people, Twitter's kind of middle of the pack in terms of where they get their information from. By far, top of the pack is YouTube. And there are, don't get me wrong, there's some issues with YouTube as well. But what it tells me is that young people are hungry for content. That YouTube is much more of a longer format as opposed to a grumpy tweet, in your face, drop the mic type situation with Twitter. And so I think it's important for us to figure out new ways to reach young people and people in general, but in the place where they're at, and not with a 2-hour video, don't get me wrong, but with content that's interesting and engaging and doesn't insult them, treats them like people who care and have passion. But for a lot of these issues, I've said as conservatives, we think and talk with our head, the left thinks and talks with their heart. We need to not concede the logic of our mind, but share it in ways that appeal to the heart. And I'll give you one quick example. We just had our first conference in February down in Miami, Florida. We had students from all across the country. We went to Florida, obviously, because thanks to Ron DeSantis, that state is free and open. But we went to Miami particularly because we wanted to bring in speakers from families that had come from Cuba, and in one case, actually a family that came from Venezuela. Each of them told powerfully passionate stories about the oppression their family lived under, about one that had an uncle that was in prison under Castro's regime for 9 years, about the absolute poverty and despair and even hunger in Venezuela. Those were things that they matched the logic of the facts telling what socialism promises and what it delivers, but being able to tell it personally was very, very appealing to our young audiences, not only there, but around the country. I think whether it's on debt or any number of other issues, we've got to find ways to not just talk with the facts, but match it with the passion, to relate it to ways that particularly young people can understand and feel about as well as think about. I think that's the key going forward. Think with our heads, but talk with our hearts. Because there's a lot of reasons to. This is a remarkable, exceptional country. We want to make sure that every person living here, those who were born here and those that legally come here, have all the same opportunities for freedom and the liberties that we've been passed on to by previous generations. We want to ensure that they're there, not just for today, but for generations to come.
Governor, thanks for your leadership. Thanks for your time today. And CJ, thanks for your partnership in making this event happen.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's such an important issue, Weston. Appreciate your coming to Milwaukee. And Governor, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. Good with you both.
Welcome back. I'm John Macco, State Representative for the 88th District in Green Bay. I am Chairman of the Wisconsin Assembly Committee on Ways and Means, and I'm here with my good colleague, Secretary Peter Barca. Secretary Barca is the Democratic Secretary for the Department of Revenue. Thanks for being here, Peter.
It's terrific to be with you, Mr. Chairman.
Right. So we've done some significant things. We had just heard about some of the dysfunction and some of the problems that we're having in Washington, D.C., but in spite of split government, we don't seem to have that problem, do we?
No, I mean, it's pretty remarkable, I think. First of all, I think you run a good committee where you You involve the minority, involve all of your members. You let them ask whatever questions they might have. And then at the end of the day, we have a standing lunch appointment once a month. Yeah. We talk through issues that are important, things that are coming up, and we've been able to find a good pathway. As a matter of fact, I think our bills are some of the few of any significance that have passed unanimously through committees and through the floor. It's been remarkable.
I know that's true. We just did AB 18, which was a little esoteric, but it federalizes the tax dates. I know you and your organization were very good last year when the feds moved those dates,
right.
And you automatically had to take that action. You did do that along with the fees and the costs of extending that out. And now we just had that again, and that bill passed last Tuesday on a 100% voice vote on a nonpartisan basis. So
that's right.
That's just a small example, but on a bigger example, we just passed AB 1, or what we were calling TEP 1 and TEP 2, and I think it's kind of neat when you get an acronym for your bills, so that was kind of fun. But why don't you tell us a little bit about the complicated nature of what that was?
Sure, absolutely. We have been working together on that for almost 2 years.
Yeah.
We called it the Taxpayer Enhancement Package.
That's right.
And it originated with some of the provisions where we had various organizations that approached the Department of Revenue and approached you as a chairman, like the realtors and developers, said we can do better with the tax revitalization historic tax credit if we could monetize those and take the credits up front.
Right.
We had the VITA program, which helps low-income and senior citizens to get their taxes done. They approached us and said we could reconfigure the homestead credit so that more veterans and more seniors would qualify. Items such as that made up probably, I think, about 2 to 3 dozen different provisions.
Yep.
And then, of course, as you rightfully said, then with Congress having acted so many different times, we had all these internal revenue code changes that took place that we had to reconcile as well.
I think about 130 of them.
That's right. Oh, yes. Yeah. I think actually probably close to 200 in the end with the last bill that President Trump had he had signed, I think the day after Christmas. So, of course, the practitioners were pulling their hair out because, tax season was set to begin just a few weeks later, and here we were trying to reconcile our tax code because of the
But there's a great example, isn't it? I mean, how we could be that responsive.
Yes.
That happens right after Christmas, and you and I are able to integrate that in there. We also put on a massive amendment. Talk a little bit about what that was.
Well, I assume you mean with the PPP issue that came up.
Sure.
So the issue was that with the Paycheck Protection Program, Congress had passed that, and the IRS had never previously allowed, nor did the Wisconsin Department of Revenue, for people to have a deduction for money that you were granted because it wasn't money that came out of your company. But in this case, many of the businesses that were hurting so desperately really lobbied hard, from, of course, the restaurants and the hotel industry, which are hurting the most, but so many others. And listening to all the debate, the legislature reconciled that. The governor wanted to have a couple things added, which, to your credit, you accepted, which was allowing people, low-income people that work 40 hours a week, 52 weeks a year, but still get the earned income tax credit, to be able to choose between their 19 and 20 income, and also to make sure that the we're all-in grants on a state level, which were the businesses that were the hardest hit, that they could also be covered. So once again, we came together, passed a bill, nearly unanimously in both houses, and really very important achievement.
And then we did a little bit of an amendment on the floor. I remember we were about to vote on it.
That's right.
And my Democratic colleagues go, Chairman, we got one more thing we got to do. I go, how did we miss that? It was in GPR, it wasn't in CARES dollars.
That's
and so we were able to go ahead, whip that up, and we had to sort of stand informal for a little bit. But we were able to get that done. And the reason we were able to get that done is because you came to us, first of all, with the big piece that we talked about, the TEP piece, but then with that, with the tax reconciliation piece, and we presented that to you, and you said, well, you're a tough guy to deal with. We're having fun right now, but we've had our moments. And you said, we've got to have these two pieces here. And then the ranking member on my committee is your predecessor. He's filled your assembly seat.
Right.
And he's been a very, very strong advocate of that side of the aisle. And so we've had to work together. How about that as a concept? And together we both were able to move the process forward.
Right. The first bill signed for the entire session.
Is it?
Yes, it was. It was.
Great.
2021 Wisconsin Act 1. So
Yep.
wasn't that beautiful?
And I said to you, you were very kind. They didn't have a ceremony that time because things were a little shut down, but you were kind enough to make sure that the governor got me the pen for that, and we'll be setting up a photo opportunity sometime in May. And I said I would be honored to have the governor in that picture so we can frame that bill, because it was a significant piece of legislation. And so I'm honored to be able to do that. And that's not always the case.
Right.
In your last budget, it was about 1,200 pages. We kind of had to go to base, but we were able to, the budget we ended up passing was about 511 pages, wasn't it? Mm-hmm. So rather than concentrate on the 700 pages that we couldn't get done, and there were some things in there I wish we could have gotten done, and I'm sure you wish we could have gotten done, we did get a lot of stuff done. There was 511 pages of stuff that we did get done. And I think that's what's missing in some of the dialogue, don't you think?
I do think so. I mean, the positive element is that at least on an individual basis, committee by committee, many committees, especially those that have chairmen that are willing to reach across the aisle and try and find, compromise, which I know is a dirty word sometimes these days, but that's the only way, the government truly works, and it's more sustainable. Because if you come together, and I think it was Congressman Gallagher that said that, if you come together and pass something, it's more of an opportunity there to have it last for, decades later.
Well, you've seen a lot. So you've been appointed deputy, the Secretary of the Department of Revenue by Governor Evers. Mm-hmm. Prior to that, you served as the minority leader in the state assembly, and you even served in Congress for a term. Mm-hmm. Actually, you had Steil's district, did you not?
That's right.
Okay.
Yes, uh-huh.
And so,
Yeah.
So you've seen a lot. What's the difference between functioning here in the state of Wisconsin versus some of the stuff you saw in D.C.?
Well, there's no question. Obviously, a state, you're much more nimble. I mean, I also was able to serve with President Clinton and the Clinton administration in a couple of capacities as the Midwest, regional administrator for the SBA, and also as the first national ombudsman on the National Regulatory Fairness Commission. I head that up, and in fact, you and I joked. I had the opportunity to speak to the new members of Congress after a couple of years over there. And I took that Judy Collins song. I see both sides now, But I think the biggest thing from the state level is you can be more nimble, you can move much quicker, you don't have the bureaucracy with having to go to the Rules Committee, even have an amendment to be considered. And so when there's a will, you can move things very rapidly in a state.
But we also have to have a balanced budget.
That's right.
I mean, that's something that we don't have there. And I think the other thing that's significant, our two congressional friends just a little while ago talked about that, is the biannual budget. I cannot imagine, Peter, if we had to have this gut-wrenching conversation every single year. Right. We have to have it every 2 years. And so I think there was some conversation a little while ago, and so everybody talks about these big macro issues that we have to do to fix government. It's like, oh my gosh, if we just went to a biannual budgeting process in D.C., that would make a difference.
It might make a difference because, frankly, I think it's been decades since they've actually passed all 13 appropriation bills. So they don't get it done anyway.
Right.
So, you'd be better off having a biennial process in order to accomplish that, frankly, on a congressional level.
Sure. So going forward, let's back up in just a second and just talk about, so you serve and you talk to your colleagues across the country. I also serve as the chairman of the Budget and Revenue and SALT Task Force for the National Council of State Legislators, so I get a feel of what some of the other states are are dealing with, and they don't enjoy this conversation, and they don't enjoy the type of budget and fiscal soundness that we do. Is that what you're finding?
I think we're in such, in a very strong fiscal position right now, and I think it's due to a lot of different things. Everything from working together on things to, the idea. I think we spent our stimulus funds from the federal government wisely to help small businesses that are the backbone of the economy, obviously, and so I think it's made a difference.
Last Tuesday, I'm not sure. We'll see how that goes.
But anyway. But no, we are in very sound shape. Of course, part of it too is we've got the right mix of industries. Like I serve on the board, the national board for the Federated Tax Administrators, and I know one of my colleagues from Nevada I've gotten to know well. They're very tourism dependent. So that's in this K-shaped recovery. They're on the bottom half of the K, unfortunately. So it's a mix, and I think Wisconsin is moving in the right direction, and I'm very upbeat and positive.
Well, that doesn't happen by accident. Whether we're in charge or you guys are in charge, over the long term, we have made a commitment that we have, I believe, the only fully funded pension administration in the entire country. Is that right? Or one of the top
That's
two?
exactly right. And it's been like that for decades. I was first elected in 1984, and we had a fully funded pension back then, and it's continued through the last 3 or 4 decades here. And that's one thing I think we've respected on both sides of the aisle, that we want to let the professionals manage that. I know you've been so close to that group, and you mentioned this morning about our new pension director, how you're very proud of them. And of course, I know you passed a very important bill with trying to ensure that we allow savings accounts to grow, and you're working on other bills as well. So we need to respect that.
Well, and that's a good point. The governor, maybe from whoever recommended it, but I served on the governor's task force this past summer on retirement readiness. And what does that look like?
Right.
Not just for the disabled folks with 529 ABLE accounts, but also in retirement accounts and some other types of things that we might be able to do to make sure that folks can not have to be dependent on the state as they get into retirement years. So those are some constructive conversations, and I absolutely didn't mind being on that committee. I was grossly outnumbered, but that was okay. I held my own, and I think we will see some legislation either in the budget or outside of that will mirror that. Now, I'm not going to get everything I wanted, but neither are those guys. But we'll get something, and we'll move that process forward. And I think that's the commitment that we have. The other thing that we've done, both this administration and previous administrations, is continue to pay down debt.
Yes.
And then you've also done a phenomenal job, sir, of refinancing some of that and taking advantage of it. And the last numbers I had, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's almost $4 million a week, $200 million a year in less debt service than we had once paid. And that's significant. How do we use that extra cash flow?
That is very significant, because obviously, it enables us then to, build up our savings accounts for the future, our rainy day fund, which is at a historic high level right now.
1.2, where is it?
I think you're right. Somewhere in the neighborhood of I think close to $1 billion now, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I think so.
But at any rate, I know that that's very important, because we never know what's around the corner.
Right.
And you have to be prepared. Nobody could have ever predicted, a worldwide pandemic and the kind of toll that would take on us in so many different ways. And I'm just so glad that we bounced back strong, and we've got to keep focused on that.
Well, and then you're absolutely right. So we've got the rainy day fund that's unprecedented in the state of Wisconsin. Now, I would love to have a conversation with you to figure out, well, what is that good bogey? I mean, is that 1.2? Is it 1.5? Is it 3? I mean, if you're Texas or you're Alaska and you've got a lot of oil reserves, it's not unusual that they would have $12 billion in their rainy day fund. We don't need that.
Right.
$2 isn't enough either.
Exactly.
And so what is that right number? And so we've done a good job of taking any excess revenue and putting that into the savings account, taking any excess revenue, paying down debt. And so when we look at some of the dysfunction in DC, that just doesn't happen here. Now, that's not true in all the states. And so, but we have done that here, and I think it really has a tendency to talk about the fact that whether you're a Democrat or whether you're a Republican, you believe in stewardship. You believe that we're just here for a short period of time, and we are taking care of things for other people. And if you have that attitude, it drives how you change and how you respond to certain things in a big way. Now, again,
just one thing, if I can interject, because commercial for Wisconsin. I think in Wisconsin we care more about stewardship than any place in the country, whether it's natural resources, whether it's our fiscal responsibility, whether it's our commitment to the kind of values of hard work and fair play. I think those are very important elements of this state that I'm so proud of.
Great. And that continues with deliberate budgeting and deliberate tax policy, and we are still running surpluses in the midst of a terrible pandemic where many other states aren't. I mean, what are our budget forecasts now with, what is our cash balance forecast for the end of our fiscal year, June now already?
We're looking at, somewhere in the $1 billion range. I mean, it's going exceptionally well. And,
that's
one
in spite
thing,
of the stuff we've already did.
That's right, exactly.
Right.
I mean, part of it, we did lapse 5% last year. We'll lapse again 5% this year, which helps. But the other thing I really believe is wise stewardship of our resources to make sure that we're helping those that most needed help to try and pull them out of this recession that we've been in.
We've got about 5 minutes left. I want to talk about a couple of little things. And one of the other pieces that you and I got a chance to work on is when, again, in my role as NCSL chair of the Budget and Revenue Committee, we are the ones that pushed the the challenge of the Quill decision through Wayfair all the way through the South Dakota Supreme Court and all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And as a result of that, we in the state of Wisconsin were able to react to that. Now, again, as a point of compromise, my colleague in the Senate, Dale Quing, and I wanted that excess revenue to be applied to all 4 income tax brackets here in the state of Wisconsin. Your administration wanted it on 1, and we compromised on 2, didn't we?
That's exactly right.
And as a result of that, both of those brackets have been brought down 50 basis points now. We went from 4 3/4 to 4 1/4 and 4 to 3 1/2. Isn't that right?
That's right. And I think it was a good compromise too, because the issue is when you focus on those lower brackets, everybody benefits. But disproportionately, you do help those that need a little bit more help. And what my economists would tell us if they were sitting here is that when you help people sort of in that middle to lower middle income category, they're the ones that spend the money, which ripples through the economy on a much faster basis. So it was a good compromise. It was a fair compromise, and I think we all feel very proud of that.
So where do we go from here? We talked a little bit about that at breakfast this morning. We had breakfast again this morning.
That's right.
And where do we see things going? I mean, we have to have we can't. You and I are. People always say, well, you must have always wanted to be in politics. I go, no, I don't even know that I need to do it now, but if we're getting some stuff done, I'd be glad to serve. I believe it's a sense of stewardship and my own personal responsibility. I know you feel the same way. It's like, hey, I'm in my 60s. I'd rather spend time with my grandkids. But if we're getting things done and it's our duty and our responsibility, both you and I are willing to do that. And so we have a longer term approach. We're not so much looking at the next election, but the next generation. And so some of the things we talked about this morning, things are dynamic. We have to move. The things, the way we funded the state are not the same. And we're talking about a major initiative you and I would like to have some conversation on, at least start having hearings on.
Right.
Talk a little bit about that.
Well, we talked a little bit about just the local option sales tax. And you were good at the end of last session. You had a hearing where we had just vibrant testimony. And of course, you always have to look at it from a competitiveness standpoint too. And Wisconsin is, we're relatively low in the sales tax arena, but we're relatively high in the property tax arena.
Right.
So we talked about how do you restructure your taxes ever so slightly on an incremental basis, but with the end in mind, you and I are both Steve Covey fans, and looking at where do you want to end up? What's the long-term goal? And the other thing that we both share, both owning businesses, is the notion of accountability, and trying to make sure that then you have more accountability by the funds that are really needed at a property tax level to fund local services related to your property versus those things that are more related to state, so you can begin to have more accountability. So it's not like at a local level, my property taxes went up. Is it the fault of the state legislators for not giving enough shared revenue, or is it the fault of my local city council for not using their money well? So I think we can get to that, and at the same time have a little bit more competitive tax structure over the long term, and one that I think will work better, especially for those, you and I both share the notion that we always feel so bad if you go knock on a door and you find a widow who's struggling between buying medicine or paying her property taxes. Very difficult. And so I think just thinking through those things, and we've talked a lot about, I know you're very in favor of looking at broadening the sales tax base, that there's certain elements that we ought to at least look at. And I know my economists appreciate that about you.
And maybe it's a little easier because we're dealing with about a $42 billion annual economy, which people need to realize we spend about $105 million every single day. And to put that into perspective, it takes about $105 million to run the city of Green Bay for a year. It takes about $100 million to run the UWGB campus in my district for a year. We burn through that, you and I, in a day. Right. And so it's massive, but it's something that we can manage. But as we look at all those various revenue streams, and there's all kinds of them, use tax, sales tax, as you sit and you break that all down, you're going, is that the most effective use to that? So I'm looking forward to having those conversations with you, and how do we move from taxing wealth, income, and property, and taxing consumption? And again, keep in mind, 40% of that would be paid by tourists anyhow. Mm-hmm. And so as we look at how do we do that and take the pressure off of our residential property owners, and I just think there's some fun dynamics that we can take a look at, and I'm willing to have that conversation and keep moving Wisconsin forward.
Yeah, well, we look forward to that, obviously, and I'm very upbeat and positive. I look forward to, we're just starting this biennial process now, and I look over the course of the next 18 months, and I think we're going to have a lot of very constructive hearings, get some great information from the wise people of Wisconsin, sure, and move forward in a positive direction.
Let's do that. Very good. I just want to thank the Millennial Debt Foundation for having us, and my colleague, Secretary Barca, for joining in. Looking forward to continuing to work with you, sir.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Great to be with you.
Thanks to Secretary Barca and Representative Macco for what I thought was an encouraging conversation about how stewardship issues and fiscal issues ought not be partisan. Thanks to the Bradley Foundation for being our host today and our partner organization, the Institute for Reforming Government. We invite you to stay in touch with us and be involved in efforts that we have ongoing across the country at millennialdebt.org. And we'll invite you in advance to our next Stewardship Series gathering in South Florida this summer.